you about the oldest known map, and if it's really a map.
So thank you, Susan, for A, inviting me, and B, for such a nice introduction. Thank you. I should say that this is actually, when Susan asked me to do this talk, and said, what would you do, not John Smith, you already done John Smith, what else would you do for this part of the world? And I was just working on a little section of a book project, and I'm just revising for submission. Should be out in early 2019, which is all about the whole idea of cartography and why we expect maps to be the way we expect them to be, when in fact they're something else. And I was just writing out this little section about this thing, which I'll come back to. So hopefully I won't get too esoteric. I can get esoteric very easily. I'm trying not to. So the History of Cartography project that Susan mentioned, my staff won't let me give any public talk without a bit of background on this. 6 volumes totaling 12 books. The last three volumes will be 1 million words apiece. Volume 3 was 1.3 million words on the Renaissance. Volume 4, well, is going to go to press next month. 1 million words, 1,000 images. I just got to finish the 3rd rewrite of the volume introduction. And yay, we can get that sucker in, and then we can just focus on volume 5 in the 19th century. That should come out in 2022. I'll wrap up the project, fire everybody, get rid of all the unspent money with a big party. In 2023, then I can have my life back. That's a huge thing. One of the things I've been able to do is persuade the University of Chicago Press, our publisher, to put the volumes online for free public access. So this is the website. Go to University of Chicago press.uchicago.edu/books. Volume 1, the 3 books of Volume 2, 2 parts of Volume 3. Next June they'll put up the 2 books of Volume 6, the 20th century volume. They're committed to putting them online within 3 years of print publication for free access. And actually you can thank the federal government for that, because they were saying, if you don't do this, we won't keep funding you. And so I could go to the press and say, if you don't do this, you won't have a product to finish up. So, nice piece of the negotiation. And this is the Osher Map Library, Smith Center for Cartographic Education, OML. Do not go down right now, because the exhibit has just gone down. We're installing the next exhibit, which opens next Thursday evening. And the next show is, I had it in my head, now I've forgotten the title. Basically, it's a show of art using cartographic motifs. I had the title in my head. Anyway, if you're online, go to eventbrite.com, look for Osher, O-S-H-E-R, and you can find the sign up and register if you have limited space. And we do have a website, oshermaps.org, which is about to get redone again, this time properly. Yay. Long story. We are putting as many of our maps as possible online for free access, so you can zoom in and play with them. Anyway, enough puffery. So, what I'm going to do, 3 parts. What is taken to be the world's oldest map, why it is maybe not a map, and some of the debates around that. Then a very quick wrap up in terms of what does this do for our understanding of cartography and the nature of maps and stuff. So if you were to ask any map specialist, what is the oldest map, the oldest real map, the oldest scale map? Not some strange little thing, maybe a map in some sense, but what is clearly a map? And they're all going to say the painted mural from the Neolithic settlement of Sat al-Hayub in Anatolia. So here are 3 books, Catherine Delano Smith in Volume 1 of the History of Cartography, a recent assessment of ancient mapping, and then a general study of the nature of representation of place, have all cited this map as the oldest map. And I can point out 3 or 4 more articles and stuff to do the same thing. To explain why this is a map, I need to explain something about the site that it was found at. Sabah is this little Neolithic settlement, sort of near Konya in central Anatolia in southern Turkey. This is a view northwards from the mound itself, looking at some hills. That's supposedly Konya over there. Here we are, ground level, looking at the mound. Now this is a classic mound formation in the sense that over time, as generations built higher up, sort of as older buildings sort of started to fall apart, they just built on top of them. And over time, over thousands of years, these sites get bigger and bigger and bigger. They can sort of make these large, what are tells in Mesopotamia. This is a relatively small tell. It's not a very large site. It's not, although it was occupied for a very long time. Here's a tell from above, and you can see the various irrigation channels. The map we're talking about, as I understand, was actually found under here. Here it is, a slightly oblique view. These are modern buildings built to protect certain diggings at excavation of the site. And you can see there's a nice modern highway right next to it, so you can get to it really easily. Now, the site was dug initially by a British archaeologist called James Mellon, who was based with the British Institute of Archaeology in Ankara for a very long time. He first excavated this site in 1958 as a temporary exploratory analysis, found a lot of interesting stuff, came back for 3 or 4 field seasons, 61 through 65, to dig more extensively. There was a slight, well actually there was a major scandal. Mellon was accused by the Turkish government of stealing antiquities and smuggling them out of the country and selling them. So he very quickly left Turkey, retired to Britain, and the site remained undug until the 1990s, when they became the focus point of an archaeologist called Ian Hodder, who's a very famous archaeologist for trying to reinterpret the way that archaeology should work, the way that archaeology should go about understanding the past. And he used the site at Satahayuk as a way to do this, but that's a secondary issue. So this is the site. Lots of earth and brick walls, some interior dividers. The argument is that these were all private dwellings. Some may or may not have had ritual significance. It's very small. There are 18 layers of these buildings. The oldest dates to about 7,500 BCE, so 9,500 years ago. And the most recent, at the top, date to about 5,600 BCE, or 7,600 years ago. So this is occupied for, this is a Neolithic settlement. So Neolithic means newer Stone Age. So this is pre-Bronze Age. Everything is done with stone, with wood, with clay. The population has been estimated to be at most 10,000 at any one time. Probably about 5,000 to 7,000 people at any particular period within this very large 2,000-year span of existence. This is more recent diggings, and you can see the several layers of settlement. they're digging simultaneously in various ways. This is also classic indication of the nature of archaeology. As soon as you start digging something, you start destroying it. Which is one of the reasons why when you are trying to reconstruct what archaeologists did 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, it becomes really problematic if they didn't keep the records as well as they should do, at least the way we do it today. That's part of the issue. And this is part of the map from the 1963 dig that Mennett's team did. And you can see these thick, these shaded walls, lines are the walls between different cells, different units within this layer of mud brick housing. One of the things that's clear on this is that each one of these is self-contained. There are no doors. Maybe a door there, but not beyond that larger unit. There's an open space here. Each of these cells, as it were, is completely self-contained. And the reason is that the construction was really very simple. It was basically mud brick, some kind of roof, probably wood. We don't really know what it is, it hasn't really survived mostly. And one entryway through the roof. The roof becomes the only point, the hole in the roof is the only point of ventilation. This is a partial reconstruction. It's nicely lit, lots of daylight. You know, you could live there, right? No, half the wall is missing to allow people to see in. The reality is this whole thing is going to be an enclosed pit in the ground with a roof and one ladder going up through a hole which may or not have a hatch of some sort over it. And so what people would do is they'd actually, there's no streets in this town. You walk over the roofs, over the flat roofs, to get to the houses, then you go in. There's an oven of some sort, looks like a little bread oven. No flues for the chimneys, so whatever you burn inside is going to be smoking inside and would have to go out through the door exit. They're very, very basic, very primitive, but they kept these sites very clean. Some archaeologists will tell you that these ancient sites, half the reason for the growth of the settlement, vertical growth over time, is that people would just throw the trash on the floor. Everything from, sorry to say, dead bodies, to the remains of your lunch, to discarded clothing and everything else. And over time, and you lay down a new earth floor because they're getting a bit stinky and you can't, difficult to walk on it. And over time, the floor starts going up, so you're going to start building up the walls, and you end up with these very strange deposits over time. None of that was going on here. This is a very clean, what they would do is they basically abandon houses after a time, and then use those abandoned houses as trash pits. But where they were living was kept really quite scrupulously clean. Here's another example. You can see a bit more. Again, this is a modern reconstruction. And you can see what the archaeologists think of as the entry access point. And then you've got these big recurring motifs throughout the site of bull's heads, clay models of bull's heads, the horns and stuff. I'll come back to these. So this is one of many. If you go online and you start Googling Sato Hayuk, there's two spellings. There's the one I'm using, which is C-A-T-H-O-U-H-O-Y-U-K, all one word with a couple of accents, or there's Satel, new word, H-U-Y-U-K. If you Google both of them, you'll find tons of these images. I mean, this is, if not the oldest town known, it's one of the very oldest towns that humans made, that we know about. And you can see people walking over the roofs. And you can also get a sense of the terracing as they're going up this site. Why did people build a town at a point where no one else on the earth, anywhere else in Europe, Asia, or Africa were building towns? To build a town, you've got to have some kind of surplus of resources. Something you can trade, something you can then take the profits from that trade, however you manifest those profits, and use them to buy food. So, in this case, in the case of Skidompha, the thing they traded was obsidian, volcanic glass, sharp, hard, makes a very nice edge. Very, very useful as a stone tool. You also make mirrors out of them. This is one of the obsidian mirrors that they found at the site. So, the argument from the archaeologist is the town developed because they had a lock on this obsidian, they could trade obsidian, and people traded extensive distances. And it was the ability to somehow there was a way of making profit from these things that allowed some people to specialize in the trade, live a non-agricultural life, and so on. Where did the obsidian come from? James Mellor thought it came from this mountain, Hassan Dawi, again in central Anatolia. Notice it's got the main peak, main volcanic crater, and a secondary peak on the side. This will become important. If Skidompha is over here, Mount Hassan is over here. According to Google, if you're walking, it's about 38 to 39 hours hike. Now that's of course for a modern person with modern size, modern stride, metal roads, bridges, everything else. About 120 miles, 190 kilometers. So it's a fair whack. You can just see Mount Hassan from Skidompha, way up in the distance. Okay, that's context. So in 1963, James Mellor and his team were digging a section of level 7. And level 7 is about 6,000 years BCE, so 8,000 years ago. And in one of these sites, one of these rooms that they dug, room number 14, along that wall, around the corner, they found a mural. Looks like this in the initial field report. You can see this sort of pattern of lines and squares, and this other pattern just above it with a slightly red tint to it. And it goes along and comes down this wall as well. In the museum now, it is preserved, so they decided, part of the issue with this site is they would whitewash the walls fairly regularly and then put more decoration on top. And then after a while they whitewash over the walls, put more decoration on top. So in working through the site, Mellor's team basically went through layer of watercolor, whitewash, by layer of whitewash to see what each one revealed. They come to this item and say, aha, this is really cool, and went no further. So we don't know what's beneath it. Nature of archaeology. This level got privileged. It's been cut out of the wall and is now preserved in the museum. And again, you can see these squares with little holes in them, and just above it, you've got this larger shape with some other stuff coming off it. And here it is in, again, a modern reconstruction. So as it is going around the bend, around the corner of the wall. And you can see more clearly the shape of the features, the weird thing up here, and then these lines going off the top. This is how it's been redrawn within the report from 1964. Now, in the report, Mellor has a long statement, which if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read a bit, because this is really quite interesting in terms of why and how he thought of it, that this is a map. Doesn't really look like a map, but he argued it's a map. The interpretation of the subject depicted is, of course, subjective and perhaps controversial, but it seems likely that the 80 or more squares drawn along the base in rows or terraces represent a view of a town, and one has only to compare figure 11 with plate 6a to see that this is indeed a possibility. So here is his figure 11, and here's his, sorry, 6a, which is the redrawing of the mural, and then figure 11 is his site of the excavations for that year from level 7. Each house has its own walls, and the internal divisions in the drawing remind one of the platforms, etc. in the plan. And one is struck by the variations and irregularities in the drawing of the individual houses. Each individual house is not on a nice rigid grid system. And similarly, while it's sort of gridded, it's sort of, there's a lot of chaos in that mural. Therefore, in our opinion, this is a representation of a Neolithic town, probably Çatalhöyük itself, the houses of which rise in exactly the same manner as is shown in the painting, that mural. So what about this then? What Mena describes a strange double-peaked object in the back. Is it double-peaked or is it four-legged? If one looks from the top of the mound today, such objects, such peaks, are easily identified as mountains. Twin cones mark the position of Konya to the northwest. Twin peaks crown the mighty mass of Karadağ, and in the far distance one sees on a clear day the double cone of Hasan Dağ. Then an active volcano, and the highest mountain in the region. Hasan Dağ had a special importance in the Neolithic inhabitants of Çatalhöyük, for it was the source of obsidian, the volcanic glass from which they made their tools and weapons, beads and mirrors, the commodity which they exported far and wide. The exploitation of the obsidian, of the obsidian fields, and a monopoly in the obsidian trade was probably the basis of Çatalhöyük's wealth. And he goes on, volcanic eruptions still stir even the most unimaginative moderns, and must have been regarded with awe by early men. This is a conception that ancient peoples were shaped by and awed by natural events. It goes back to the 18th century as an argument until the rise of, quote, true religion, in the words of Adam Smith, the economist, at which point everybody says, oh no, that's just God. And we shift the awe to God, not to the natural features. It's a very long-standing, embedded argument. This brings one to the spots on the mountain, the objects spurting out of the right-hand top, the cloud of dots and strokes above, and to the right of it, and the lines extending from the base of the mountain. All these can be interpreted as the usual phenomena of a volcanic eruption. The rain of glowing volcanic bombs and red-hot rocks, the cloud of growing particles above it, and perhaps tongues of lava welling up from vents near the base of the mountain. It's known that the Central Anatolian volcanoes were active until the 2nd millennium BC. An eyewitness painting of an early 7th millennium eruption of Hasan Dağ is therefore certainly a possibility, and in view of its economic importance, a highly relevant subject to be recorded in a shrine. It seemed to make sense. So basically, the argument is the squares look just like how the archaeologists are reconstructing the houses, because the archaeologists are reconstructing what survived, which is the mud brick, not the wooden ceilings, roofs. And the upper register is a realistic image of erupting volcano, specifically Hasan Dağ. And therefore this is a map, and it's dated about 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BCE, and therefore you can call this the oldest known real map. And as I said, it's widely accepted as such. All of you so far? Great. But is it a map? Then a grad student, Stephanie Meese, one of Hodder's students, published this article in 2006, which argues that no, it's not a map. And her argument is actually really quite interesting. It starts to pull apart some basic concepts. One is that one of her key points is that originally, when you go back into Mellett's field notes, rather than the published results, in the published results it's a map. But in the field notes, it makes clear that he and his team originally thought, you know, it's just a geometrical design. Just another one of many. Only later did they say, oh wow, it looks just like our maps, therefore it's a map. So the site has all these other geometrical designs. Tons of them, all different kinds, all different shapes, different sizes. There's also some realistic images, images of, especially of hunting scenes, hunting large bulls, hunting deer, that kind of stuff. These geometric patterns are so common that you find them being recreated in all the modern reconstructions. I mean, these are very much, this is what this site is all about, these interior decorations. Of course, we have no idea what these interior decorations mean because we have no written record to help us interpret what they might mean. The other thing that's very common on this site are leopards. And this is and several of them are actually raised. In the plastering of the walls, they make a raised plaster for the leopard, and we paint the leopard spots. So, Meese, working within this new system that her advisor Ian Hodder is championing as an archaeologist, which entails a basic art historical principle. If you're going to start interpreting an image, you have to put that image into its context. And the context of this one long, 9-foot long mural, that graphic context is all these other images of leopards, of geometrical designs. So from that point of view, it's just a geometrical design with a leopard skin on top. A second point is that the reference to that volcano is actually wrong. First of all, subsequent research after 1964 has proven that the obsidian that the town traded in did not come from that volcano, Dassan-Hor. It came from a different source. Dassan-Hor's obsidian is too brittle. You try to work it, you imagine you're working flint to create shards of flint. You've got to hit the flint, nodes of flint to separate off little flakes, which you can then use for knives and stuff. You hit a block of obsidian from Dassan-Hor and the whole thing will shatter. It's just not good obsidian for working as tools. Rather, it comes from a different set of volcanoes. So the obsidian came from somewhere else, and more importantly, this is actually not in Meese, this has come out just very recently. Hassendorf was actually inactive, had been inactive for about 1,500 years by the time that this mural was painted. So, I'm a firm believer in folk memory and stuff, but if you don't have lots of other images of the site to help recreate the sense of the volcano erupting, then 1,500 years is a bit too long for an oral description of an erupting volcano. So, That doesn't work either. And then thirdly, and this for me is the real kicker, why should Neolithic painters have used modern style imagery to represent their town? Why do they focus on the walls? The archaeologists focus on the walls because that's what survived. But when people make maps or other images that refer to their homes, their places, or urban, they tend to use other things. For example, well, you can see this very easily on big non-modern mapping of big areas of the world, of large parts of the world. This, for example, is an image from 1958 of Bharat Mata, Mother India, the goddess of India, that's part and parcel of the independence movement, who's been mapped onto a map of India itself. This is the outline of India, Sri Lanka down here. You see this kind of symbolism routinely for large areas. Here's an Islamic map from the 12th century. Anybody want to tell me what this is of? I'm here in Turkey.
Hanging jars.
Say again?
Hanging jars.
No. Yes, but no. I'll put you out of your misery. This is the Mediterranean. And the same book has a map following it of the Indian Ocean that looks really, really quite similar. It's not a map, it's not a sea chart of the kind that we think about as sea charts in the European tradition. This is a landlubber's conception of the Mediterranean as a closed space full of islands. Each one of these islands has a little label, mostly just saying island. Crete, Cyprus, all the towns. Now the anonymous mapmaker, these are 12th century, well, this is a 12th century copy of an 11th century original that's lost. In the 11th century, this merchant retired. And having made his pile, he decided that he's going to get that which separates him from the aristocracy. And that's an education. So he writes this book as a sort of a way to teach himself. One half is astronomy, the other half is geography. And the whole thing is called the Book of Curiosities. It's now at the Bodleian Library. The whole thing's online, translated. It's a wonderful resource. He lived in the Nile Delta in a town called Tanais. And the thing about Tanais is a living embodiment of a lot of early Islamic philosophy, which is the world, actually, a lot of early Christian philosophy for that matter. The world is degrading, the world is changing, it will end. We are past the days of the saints, we are in the corrupt world, Christ is gone, and for Christians, we are just declining, and the world is changing. And in that situation, you don't map the precise outlines of all the coasts and the islands and all the rest. What you're interested in is the essence of the place. And the reason that Tanais was a sort of living embodiment of this is there's on the other side of the Nile Delta, the east side, away from Alexandria, and basically the harbour works over Alexandria had changed the current patterns, and what had been a nice little port all of a sudden was eroding. And by the time this merchant was writing, half of Tanais had already fallen into the Mediterranean. It's a living book. The world changes. Why show what is when you should be showing the essence of the world? You see this in medieval Christian mapping, you see it in Islam, you see it in Buddhist mapping. It's a very old philosophical concept. So in this sense, there's a map of the Mediterranean, but it's not interested in precise outlines. I should say that the same text refers to a classical work out of Alexandria by Claudius Ptolemy called the Geography, which in the Renaissance Europe will be this major text. And his comment in here in the book is basically, Yeah. We know it, we don't like it. For the same reason, if you go to Venice, I don't know if you went to the Biblioteca Marciana, but hanging up in the Biblioteca Marciana is a great 4-foot diameter circular wall map by a Venetian priest from about 1450 called Fra Mauro, who claims to be who claims to be making maps in a really scientific way, up-to-date way. So he has comments on there saying he went down to the docks to talk to the mariners. And the Mediterranean outline is taken straight from the medieval sea chart, so you can see Italy and Greece and all the islands really, really nicely. But he also has this whole thing saying, yeah, Ptolemy sucks. Ptolemy just gives you coastlines, it gives you points, and everything else is blank. As a Catholic priest, what he wanted to do was show a world full of God's grace. So he made a completely different style map, still scientific by his light, but it's full of information, full of notations. It's got all Marco Polo's journeys and stuff. It's wonderfully big and complex. This is not done the way that we would do it today. And this really becomes clear when you start looking at how people map place, where we live, our homes. This is a map, very recent, 1985, made by an Aboriginal group from North Australia, from Arnhem Land. It's part of their internal knowledge. We are free to use this image because it was specifically made to be given to Anglos, to be displayed in Anglo museums. It's not something that's been stolen out of an Aboriginal ritual site, anything like that. It's called Crocodile and Fire Dreaming, and it's a map of this one tribe's home. That back legs make a shape that's sort of like part of the coastline, part of Arnhem Bay, and this is a river valley. What else it all means, who knows? They're not telling. It's part of a sort of internal economy of knowledge that is kept sacred to this particular group. Or this map, Mocha landscape vessel from pre-Incan Andes. This is a map of a valley. The Andean peoples are renowned, actually, if you read volume 2, book 3 of the History of Cartography. There's a great chapter in there by Bill Gardner, which actually argues that the Incans and previous groups didn't map horizontally because the Andes have these really deep valleys. What they did, they mapped vertically. They made relief models. So the mounds around here are the hills surrounding this valley, and the fox is an emblem of constellation that ties to the god who protects the people in this valley. So it's a very complex, religious, domestic, three-dimensional map of their particular valley. Both this and the crocodile and fire dreaming, you can only get at, you can only start to understand and appreciate if you have some understanding of the indigenous culture that produced it. And every human culture produces its own images and its own ways of representing place in different ways. So for example, pretty modern example, here's the southern Spanish city of Seville, and here's the Giraldo, standing very large, very tall, is the tower to the cathedral. This to Seville is what the Eiffel Tower is to Paris, or Big Ben in Westminster Palace is to London, or the Capitol is to DC. Every time you go to Paris and you look at tourist tat, half of it's got the Eiffel Tower on it. Go to London, half the tourist tat's got the Big Ben, or the Tower of London, or whatever it may be. But there are certain things that come to stand for the city. In Seville, the locally produced tiles and everything else have images of the Giraldo on it. This is the symbol of Sevilla, and it's reproduced accordingly. It's not a cartographic symbol in that sense, but rather it's something that everybody within the know takes to be the map, the place, what's the representative place. Little aside, how many of you know the London Underground map? Fair number. It's a really weird map. If you try to navigate London Underground, you get to know it very well. There's a recent argument in Forbes magazine that, or Financial Times, sorry, that London, if Britain does in the end, as it looks like it's going to do, leave the European Union, London should leave Britain and rejoin the EU as a size of its economy. And as a throwaway line, he said, and the map of an independent London should be the underground map. Because that map has become totemic of London itself. So in the case of Çatalhöyük, if you're thinking through this kind of practice, then we could argue, again, it's purely hypothetical, that maybe what stands for the town, at least in some parts of its existence, because 2,500, 2,000 years is a very long time for cultures. Cultures don't stay static for 2,000 years. Maybe the emblem are these ox heads that you find all over the site. Maybe this is the town in contemporary argument. Then there's the fact that when you actually do get people making scaled maps of urban places, like architecture and cities and stuff, is always in conjunction with really big public housing projects, public building projects. So, Gudea was the Prince of Lagash in north of Babylon, north of modern-day Baghdad, who created this huge empire, after which he built this great big ritual center in which he did a whole bunch of things, including, there are a couple of statues of himself. This headless one, the head's been knocked off. On the lap has this plan of a enclosing wall of a temple. And of course, they haven't actually been able to figure out that this wall was actually built, but it's there. Here is the stylus that you would make on a clay tablet, drawing on a clay tablet. And damaged across the bottom was a graduated scale to specify the units in which this thing was to be built. And there's another statue of him with the stylus and the perfect scale on, but no plan. And what's really great about these things is you've got all this cuneiform text that explains exactly what this statue is supposed to be doing, where it's supposed to be located within this temple to the prime god. And so this ruler becomes part of the rituals of the god for posterity, well, at least for the 100 years or so that his empire lasted after his death. Or in this case, a plan of Nippur, the city of Nippur from 1500 BC. This one is 2000 or so BCE, so 4,000 years old. This one's about 3,500 years old. Clay tablet. And you've got indication of the walls, which, when you relate them to the archaeological dig of the walls, here's the big canal, the irrigation, here are the walls, here's a little point where the walls come together. So you can see that this clay tablet is either recording a construction, planning a construction, built in part in some way. And you find tons and tons and tons of these kinds of images being produced. Once you start to get public buildings, public construction, and remember that the Çatalhöyük, the argument is they only have private dwellings. There's no big public buildings, there's no big public spaces. Says something about the nature of government, maybe. And then, Çatalhöyük only has, most 10,000 people, 5,000 to 7,000 people. In 1722, the population of Boston was about 10,500 people, which is when the first map of Boston was printed. And it wasn't printed as a guide to the inhabitants of how to get around the city. It was printed as a way to say, hey guys, we made it. We're thriving. The Boston, this is just this is the neck of Boston, so this is the start of the common here. This is the back bay that's going to be filled in the 19th century. North End's over here, right? So North Station's on this road out there. So, up until this point, Boston is what's called a walking city. Everybody walks, unless you're actually hauling something. Everybody knows, it's just that little section of Boston that anybody can walk and discover in like a day, quite easily, 2 days maybe. Well, 3 counts topping up the pints of beer. And if you don't know the space, you can find where people are really easily by their time-honored method of asking. So these early maps of even modern cities aren't actually made initially to serve as guides to people, to the stranger, to the tourist, how to get around. But rather they're made to display a sense of quality, a sense of style. In this case, in 1722, Boston had just suffered a smallpox epidemic. They had just suffered yet another fire. And there's actually a list down here of the great fires and the smallpox epidemics that have periodically burnt down Boston, periodically killed up to 10% of the Boston population. And exactly at this point, there's a huge new migration from Europe, especially the Irish. The first Irish immigration into Boston, not the 1840s. That's the second. And you end up with a city that's in crisis, but at the same time, it's trying to thrive, and it's trying to present itself as thriving and so on. And the way it does show stuff is through buildings, rooms, and all the rest of it, but the overlarge, long wharf, all other features are sort of partially indicated and so on. There is a sense in which that map of Çatalhöyük is maybe a statement, this is the town, but I think it's more likely to be the reason this town is shown this way, not in terms of, this way, is because of a change of style, a change of convention. We got to a point where we should show towns in a planned view like this, rather than view or facades of Fennel Hall, or whatever it is that's going to embody Boston, or the Red Sox logo. That's how you show Boston nowadays, right? Red Sox. Not even the Patriots. And finally, I'm just going to say that the argument that men have put forward is incredibly circular and hesitant. He starts off saying it's objective, it seems likely. He says, it seems likely that the squares drawn along the basin rows, or maybe they're terraces. It's a possibility. And as you go through, it sort of reminds me of one is struck by, and sort of there's this sort of vague distancing. Probably, but at the same time, it's all this uncertainty builds up into a great statement of factuality. But those terraces become the houses of the city rise in exactly the same manner as is shown in the painting. So you go from the hesitant or terraces to terraces. And you go from the larger issue, the room is a shrine for Mellot because it has his mural. But then he justifies the existence of the painting of a volcano as a source of the city's wealth because it's a shrine. All this is to say, it's probably just one more decorative mural. Final implications. I have one slide. I could go on at length about this. The reason that people want to insist that this map, this image, is indeed a map, and there's a whole bunch of people post-Mies who asserted it is because they want to keep the sense that a map is defined simply by what it shows. That someone goes out, you measure the world, and that measurement allows you to recreate the world in paper, on a wall, in pixels on a computer monitor, whatever it may be. But that sense of realism, the sort of figurativeness of mapping, is a strictly modern convention. And that's actually what this whole really huge book is all about. And it's a convention that only actually develops after 1800, at least in modern fashion. And when you start digging into any kind of modern map, I could have done a whole talk just on this map. That would really bore you. When you start digging into any kind of map, you start realizing that every single one of them reveals cultural conventions, social reasons for making maps and the way the maps are made. So in this case, this is Logan, Utah, Cache Valley, upper Lake Bonneville, basically Lake Bonneville area. Wasatch Front down here with a whole bunch of green. Green represents trees, right? You got there, this is national forest, tons of trees, it's very pretty, highly recommend it. How do the surveyors in this modern USGS topographical map, how do USGS surveyors, map makers, figure out what is woodland and what is not? You know, there are trees out there, right? But, you know, we live in a very wooded state. You know, there are times when the trees are really dense together, and there are times when trees are very scattered. How dense do they have to be before you say, yes, this area is green? And how do you draw the edge of the tree? Do you have somebody on the ground going along, looking at the edge of the canopy, and mapping out the edge of the canopy, or they're mapping out the tree trunks, and that's the extent? Or what? The problem is that woodland, like shorelines, marsh edges, these kinds of things, are soft data. And for surveyors, they're very hard to fix. Hard data, like buildings, corners of buildings, curbstones on a road, those are really good to fix. You know where that edge is. But you know, you do a shoreline at the high level, watermark, low watermark, spring high tide, spring low tide, somewhere in between. How do you define something in between? Well, you do it completely arbitrarily, but same way you define where the woodland is. You just got to stress, these are the US Geological Survey, these are civilian maps. How then do they figure out what's green? If you go way back in the history of USGS, they did not have woodlands on maps. Partly it was a technical issue, solid color printing was a problem for them. They were insisting on using copper, which is only lines. But then in about the 1930s they start using woodland because they start running aerial photography. And they can do some geometrical fixing on the aerial photography to get it to match up to the horizontal geometry of the map. And then some air photo interpreter sitting in a dark lab somewhere looks at these air photos and looks at the depiction of forest, mostly in black and white at this point, looks at the depiction of forest and says, or trees, or vegetation, or any kind of stuff, and says, can an infantryman in full battle dress be hidden beneath his foliage? If they can be, it's green on the map. So you have a completely arbitrary social monetary criterion that's used to define a basic understanding of natural environment. And you can see this kind of little fun nuance over and over again, to the point where maps just sort of become these wonderful things. Don't get me wrong, maps used in the way they're intended to be used can be really, really effective. Road maps, GPS, all the rest, great. But they all have these other factors built deep inside them that make them really fun to study. Thank you.